My name is Eva Green. It's my privilege to be the moderator for today's event, where we will discuss the Second Amendment and how the right to bear arms affects you, the city of Chicago, and our communities as a whole. I'm going to ask each of you, gentlemen, please, to begin your opening statements. If you can give us a brief overview of current gun laws in Chicago and Illinois and your position on people's right to bear arms. You each have 5 minutes. Mr. Williams, can you please start us off?
Thank you so much, Eva, for having us, and thank you for everyone joining today. This is a very important conversation, and I want to begin by thinking about what the Second Amendment actually means and what it says. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. These few words have been very controversial since they were coined in 1791. And even at that time, when these words were written, the federal government did not allow people to bring guns into federal buildings even then. Today, we live in a country where we have the unfortunate distinction of being one of the most violent societies in the world. Americans average about 12,000 gun murders every year, about 19,000 suicides by handgun every year. Handguns are used in 70% of all murders in this country, and our murder rate is 25 times other industrialized nations. We live in an extremely violent society, and we have easy access to guns. There are about 300 million people in this country and about 300 million guns. We have a gun for every man, woman, and child. The problem in our country is not that we can't do anything about this issue, is that we choose not to do anything about this issue because we have a really poor, I believe, interpretation of the Second Amendment. Many people believe, as many lobbying groups believe, that the Second Amendment gives the right for every citizen to protect themselves and their homes. But if you look closely at the Second Amendment and you read further into the Constitution, you will see in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the Article 1 being the part of the Constitution that gives direction for the legislative branch of government, you will see that the Constitution itself lays out what the militia ought to be doing. The Constitution very clearly states that the militia is to be run by the state government, to be armed by the state government, to be trained by the state government, and to follow the disciplines that are prescribed by Congress. The idea that every man, woman, and child should be able to carry a weapon in this country does not even exist in the Constitution. In fact, the militia, which was created so that we would not have to have a standing army, that we'd have a volunteer army of citizens who would come forth and who would protect their communities, is a much different cultural context than the one that we live in today. We do have a standing army today. We do have a police force today. We do have protections, and there is no need in 2017 to have such easy access to guns. I am a firm believer that if you look at the number of guns in our society and the number of guns in communities like ours, there's no secret why we have so much gun violence. In fact, we have very tight gun laws, and people will tell you all the time that Chicago, you've got a ton of gun laws in the city, so what's the problem? Don't you see that you have gun laws and it doesn't stop crime? Well, the reality is that we do have a lot of gun laws in Chicago, but we have very little gun laws and very few gun laws in the state right next to us, which is Indiana. So because there are no metal detectors on the border, you could walk right across the border, go get as many guns as you want through a gun show. We still have a gun show loophole in this country where you can straw purchase, buy large blocks of weapons, bring them across the border, and use those in crimes. The vast majority of guns that are picked up in the streets of Chicago don't originate here. They originate from neighboring states like Indiana. So what I'm suggesting today, ladies and gentlemen, is that when we look at the issue of gun violence, we are all perplexed by it. We are all bothered by it. We should all be horrified by the amount of violence. But I am suggesting that those who argue for the Second Amendment rights for everyone to carry a weapon, which, by the way, the Supreme Court argued, which I fully disagree with in two recent cases. I fully disagree with those, and I'll explain why later. But those who argue, though, that those, I believe, are more a part of the problem than they are a part of the solution. And until we change this erroneous and broken interpretation of the Second Amendment, I think that we're going to continue to see high levels of violence in our society for many days to come. And I would ask that we would begin to change our minds and start reinterpreting this amendment, which is so critical to our life and our health today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Professor Williams did an excellent job at presenting facts and statistics on the current state of gun use and gun violence in this greatest country on God's green earth. I don't want to get too philosophical to start off, but William Blackstone, one of the 18th century jurists in England, pretty much developed the concepts that carry on into our legal system today in England. We call that common law. He stated that our primary law is self-defense, and that no human law shall, basically override that primary law. We all are familiar with the idea of self-defense. I'm pretty sure many of you in the audience, you have a visceral feeling within you when someone tries to cause you bodily harm to react. Am I correct in that, for the most part? And I think that's where the basic idea of having a right to bear arms comes from, that basic human necessity to feel the need to not only defend yourself, but to defend your family, defend your wife or husband or children, your mother, your father, and defend your household. Times are different. I agree with you, Professor Williams. We live in a totally different society than we did in 1791. In 1791, our country was rural for the most part. I believe that the largest city numbered no more than 30, 40,000 people. To us, that's a very small neighborhood in Chicago. Chicago now is 1.5 million, 2.5 million people. So that's a totally different environment and living situation than which we were living in during the time that the Second Amendment was written. The Second Amendment's words are very, very peculiar. And these guys who were the framers of the Constitution, they had a good handle on the English language, I would say. So I don't buy the argument that there was any ambiguity in what they were actually writing. But they started off with a well-regulated militia. So I guess the question would be, what is a militia? When we think of the militias of those days, those militias rose up against the redcoats or the British, and they were not a part of the state. They were rebels and were actually enemies of the state. So these framers coming, directly from, that war, that Revolutionary War, what in their mind is a militia? Is a militia a direct arm of the state, or is a militia the people who decided, in their own sovereignty, they can defend themselves and take things into their own hands. The Constitution does not explicitly give us the right to revoke, but it does have words in there that basically hint at our right to dissolve the government if the government need be dissolved. I think that's something that Abraham Lincoln battled with during the Civil War. When the southern states decided to secede from the Union, he had to decide whether this was actually legal, whether they actually had the right to do so. And I believe that Abraham Lincoln did state that those people had the right, but it was a battle within us to keep our Union strong. So the Second Amendment, in my opinion, is very important. Gun control is very important, and as we continue the discussion, I think we will see some of the ways in which gun control is very controversial, yet even in our modern society, gun control can and does work for many of us. I'm sorry, gun rights can and does work.
I was like, hey, you're on my side now.
We're agreeing over here. I'm going to come join you guys. Thank you, Mr. Darden. So I just want to ask you guys, you got into kind of the background of the Constitution and when it was written. Can we just explore a little bit more about what kind of guns were accessible back then? How has that changed, as well as who those rights applied to when the Constitution was written?
Sure. So we all know that the level of guns, the kinds of guns that were in existence then are much different from what we have now. So you're looking at muskets. And weaponry that would require you to have minutes of time in which you had to reload physically, shoot one bullet, go back, reload, get gunpowder, that sort of thing, and shoot again. We also know that the Constitution, the Second Amendment, was really only meant to be interpreted for free landowning white males at the time. And so slaves could not own guns, women could not own guns, etc. Oddly enough, that the same year that the NRA, which is the largest pro-gun group in America, the largest arm of gun rights, a very powerful group, so powerful that after crises like Sandy Hook and the other school shootings that we saw, the NRA lobbied Congress and made it so that people actually bought more guns in the country than gun sales going down. And so the NRA has prevented gun legislation from being passed for years. The irony is that the NRA and the KKK were actually founded at the exact same time. They were both founded for whatever purposes they are, and I would make the case, in this history of race and class and inequality, that gun rights were not necessarily meant for people in inner cities of color, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that you've got a lot going on here. The idea, once again, that these guns would be used to protect America from the bad people, if you will. And at the time, the Constitution lays out who that would be. They were talking about Native Americans. They were talking about the British. They were talking about the French at this time. But I would suggest that today, if you look at the use of the Second Amendment, many people believe that they're to keep bad people out today. And the bad people they're talking about are not Native Americans. They're not the British, and they're not the French. They are inner city people that they are afraid that are coming to their neighborhoods to come and to steal and take their stuff. And so there is this narrative of, look at the crime in the inner city. If you have a gun, wherever you are, that crime will not get into your neighborhood. And I think it's a very sick and false narrative that needs to be dispelled.
Would you agree?
I disagree.
Okay.
Starting with the first point of the types of guns, I think we may agree somewhat there, Professor Williams. In the 1700s, the late 1700s, when the Second Amendment was created, Professor Williams is right. I mean, can you imagine having a gun, especially in a war, where you got people shooting at you, where it takes, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Williams, about 4 to 5 minutes to load a musket, and you have to, bite it and load it and put powder in there and things like that. That's a totally different situation than the type of guns that we had now. That time was, called the Enlightenment, where there was a great movement of ideas and philosophies. We hadn't quite hit onto the scientific revolution. That didn't come to almost 40 or 50 years later. And we had one of the scariest wars ever in human history because of it. That was the Civil War. The Civil War killed so many people that it was probably the biggest bloodbath that in human history. We had automatic weapons. We had machine guns that can repeat fire in rapid rates, unlike anything that we've ever seen. People were just basically lining up for slaughter. I don't think that the framers of the Constitution saw that coming. I don't think that they knew that firearms would advance to such a level to which they can cause so much damage at one time. And I think, some type of gun control is necessary, but we always must be careful when we give up any type of liberty for protection, because anytime you give up a liberty for protection, you can end up losing all of your liberty. Being in an urban environment is much different than being in a rural environment. I agree. But I think that we still have some things that are still the same. You are less likely to threaten someone or cause harm to someone if you know they have the ability to react. If you know that they don't have the ability to react or protect themselves, you are a lot less likely to approach that person with any intent to do harm to them. And I think that is something that's very important. Now, of course, Professor Williams, you would know a lot more than I about larger cities, probably not as large as Chicago, but comparatively, that have less gun control and more guns, and how they weigh up against Chicago. But I do know one thing, that we do find wherever gun control is less, or where gun rights are higher, we do find less acts of violence. The idea of a criminal having a gun is a lot different than the idea of a citizen having a gun. A citizen is a legal person. That citizen is believed, in the ideal sense, to be a virtuous person. So you wouldn't expect that citizen to commit a crime. But a criminal is a crime. They are inherently evil, felonious, and that person will get a gun whether there's a law or not. So the gun violence in Chicago right now, is that gun violence being created by legal citizens, or is that gun violence being created by criminals who will have a gun whether there's a gun law or not?
If I could respond quickly. So I agree with you. I think we are agreeing on some points. I think it's very good. I do think that criminals are going to be criminals, and they're going to do what they want to do. But the issue of access to guns is a real issue. If you look at a country like Japan, there is no access to guns in a country like Japan, and Japan, oddly enough, has very little crime and murder in the nation. We are one of 4 countries in the world with a constitutional right to bear arms. These countries are extremely not sort of safe places that you look at. Mexico, Haiti, Guatemala, and the U.S. are the 4 countries in the world with a constitutional right to bear arms. I would suggest that when you look at the issue of access, it's kind of like if you think about McDonald's as a marketing strategy. If McDonald's wants more people to eat French fries and hamburgers, they're going to put more McDonald's in your neighborhood. If they want less people to eat French fries, they're going to put less McDonald's. People who want to eat McDonald's are going to eat McDonald's anyway, but you make it more difficult if there's not as much access. It's the same thing I would say about guns. And when you look at the notion of cities like Chicago, people make this argument all the time. Well, a city like Chicago, it's violent and it has a lot of gun laws. They don't have a lot of gun laws in Texas, and Texas is less violent. That assumes that violence is only connected to guns, the amount of guns in society, and not. I would suggest that not only is gun control an issue, but if you look at poverty is an issue around crime and violence. Inequality is an issue around crime and violence. Economic opportunity, you can go all the way down the line. Segregation, isolation. Chicago has more gun violence than New York and Los Angeles combined. And you have to ask yourselves, why is that the question? Well, I hypothesize that it has a lot to do with Chicago also being the most segregated city in this country. And that you could literally in our city go for miles and miles and be only around people of one ethnicity and only around people from one economic and socioeconomic status. Whereas in LA and New York, those things are a little bit more difficult. You have a little bit more sort of economic diversity. And so what I'm suggesting is that Chicago is violent not just because of sort of the gun issue, but we have other factors, and Houston or Dallas may be less violent for other reasons as well.
What would you say would be, what is the way to decrease violence? We talked about lots of economic issues and other societal issues. So what would be your recommendation if you do not want to infringe on people's Second Amendment rights? How do we decrease gun violence in our communities?
Decreasing gun violence in our most violent communities in the U.S. and especially in Chicago, I think is very important to look at the source of the issues that demographic faces every day. Usually it's an economic one. Some people will argue it's a cultural one as well. So, looking at that issue in particular, not just the guns themselves. I mean, we can go out in this neighborhood that we're in now and hand every single person a gun. Right now, I don't think that that's going to be the cause of them to shoot each other, but it'll be the things and the struggles that they're going through every day outside of those guns. Could you imagine if they couldn't access guns? Do you think the violence would stop? Maybe they would, throw bricks at each other or, knives or something like that. I don't think that would necessarily inhibit the violence. There's other, pertinent social and economic issues that need to be addressed.
We talked a little bit about, when the Constitution was founded, what kind of guns were accessible. Do you, either of you, and I encourage you to engage with each other, where is that line as far as what guns should be accessible? Who should be allowed to own guns? Background checks? What kind of regulations should be in place, and where is that line for each of you?
So here's the problem with Okay, so I'm actually going to agree with you for a second, completely on this, okay? I don't think gun control as it stands really works all that well. And the reason why I don't believe that gun control works the way that it stands is because we have 50 different state governments, 50 different sets of gun laws, and so unless you are going to enforce gun laws across the border, it really kind of is a waste of time. The other thing I would suggest is a waste of time, which I would support. My position, just for the record, is I don't think we should have guns in our culture, period. I think that we ought to work to reduce the amount of guns and the amount of access to guns. I'm very clear on that. But I also think that when, say, the Democrats, right, so I talk about I teach politics, so I'm sorry to get political, but please bear with me, okay? So the Republicans are very pro-gun rights. Let's, everybody have a gun, we'll all be happy. Kumbaya, let's all shoot in the sky kind of thing. And the Democrats are very much like, oh, well, we need to have restrictions, but those restrictions are very sort of minor restrictions. So Democrats say that we should have no assault rifles. We should not have semi-automatic weapons. These are things, with high-capacity magazines where you could kill many people in a quick amount of time. They take a stand against those, which I agree. Why on God's earth would we have those accessible to people? But they won't go any further and say that we should also ban handguns, which are used in 70% of murders. So I think that both positions are wrong. I think we've got to actually go further. And to his point, yes, you could kill with a knife. Yes, you could kill with a brick. Yes, you could kill with a shoe. Yes, you could kill with a pen. But the reality is that people are not being killed by bricks and shoes and pens in this society. 70% of people who are being murdered by handguns, and that's a real issue.
I want to touch on something. You mentioned the different state laws that we have. We have 50 states, and all of them are different. You brought up Japan earlier and Mexico. Every society is really different. Every area is so different. And, it's hard to really compare them without considering a lot of different variables and lining up those variables and testing them over and over. For instance, in Japan, didn't they just have a bomb go over their head? And if I'm not mistaken, Japan is a demilitarized society. The fear that they're living in right now, could you imagine, every other day after a Trump tweet, waking up in the morning and having to do a drill because you're scared for your life that your country is going to be bombed. This is a culture of people who had an atomic bomb dropped on them, who made a conscious decision, whether over the threat of diplomacy from the United States or just over some type of moral rectification in their own culture for the war that they carried on during World War II. And they decided to take an economic front and to demilitarize themselves. So now they gave up their guns as a country, not as a citizenry. The government doesn't have ability to protect themselves from North Korea. I'm pretty sure if you follow the news, you've heard about what's been going on there. So now they're sitting ducks. Now they have to rely on a country that's led by a president who many believe is a hothead, who's unstable, who is wishy-washy. He may make big
North
threats.
Korea or us?
Oh, I'm sorry, both. But I'm talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about President Trump,
Sure.
And I respect President Trump. I support any president that we have for obvious reasons. I love my country, but these are what people feel. These are viewpoints that people have against President Trump. So imagine being in your own country in which you cannot protect yourself and you have to rely on someone who you feel is, how I just described President Trump, for your safety. That's tough. And I think that's where, gun rights is very important. Do you give up your right to defend yourself to someone else and put total trust in them to do so? I don't believe too many of us, because I come from the same community and the same culture that you do. So I'm almost sure that, many people in this audience would not want to give up that sovereignty to do so. If I can carry on. We got rural areas of the state of Illinois, for instance, that are much, much different than Chicago, right? I grew up in Chicago, and how often do we go boating? and hunting, learning how to, kill pheasants and shoot bow and arrows and things like that. So that culture is a lot different from an urban culture. And that culture is one of survival. So when you go way out into the country, let's say DeKalb County, that culture is being played out because they are living in a ruder state of nature than we are in Chicago. Chicago is a beautiful city. It's built up. It's been cultivated, right? We have an ability to sustain life with less effort than people living in rural areas. So the cultural aspect of guns is huge and something that I think a lot of people wouldn't want to give up, not only because of a threat to their lives, but also because of a culture.
In playing off of cultural ideas and the threat with guns in communities, but also what we did see with Sandy Hook and what we are seeing with kind of mass shootings in schools, and what is the difference? What are we seeing differently of violence in communities and violence of someone going in and shooting 50 preschoolers? What is the difference there, and how do we deal with that differently?
When it comes to school shootings and mass shootings, I think I would kind of agree with Professor Williams. I don't think that someone in this audience right now having a gun would necessarily detract a mass shooting from occurring. I could see a situation where if we had some type of gun control laws preventing access to, assault rifles that can, have a bullet in the gun without having to load it for every single person in the room. I mean, that's scary, as opposed to, handguns that only allow 6 shots or 9 shots. That means, technically only 6 or 9 people would die before someone is able to bring that person down. But to have an automatic rifle that can create mass mayhem and especially a highly populated, densely populated area like an urban city like Chicago, that's a scary thought.
It's interesting because Chicago just had a court case called McDonald versus City of Chicago a few years ago. And prior to that, D.C. had a court case called Heller versus D.C. And both of these cases essentially did the exact same thing. Prior to both of these cases, there was a handgun ban in the city of Chicago and in Washington, D.C. And people were very upset. The McDonald's case was about a guy who was a senior citizen who lived in the Morgan Park community and who argued before the Supreme Court that I am not safe because I don't have the ability to have a gun in my home. But this was a false story. And the reason why it was a false story was because even under a 20-year handgun ban in Chicago, people still had access to rifles and shotguns, which they could have kept in their home and could have protected themselves in their home if they so chose to do so. So the idea that we have to have more access to different kinds of guns and we have to sort of proliferate the amount of weapons in our society for us to be safe is lunacy. If you want to protect yourself, there are other options besides a handgun. You've got shotgun rifles, that sort of thing, which are, obviously a little more difficult to use or difficult to kill people with, et cetera, but you still can. But there are also non-lethal weapons. I would suggest personally that here's a radical thought, I don't think the police should really carry weapons as much as they do in our society. I think that the reality is, if you look at some European nations, you will see that there are efforts to deal with violent conflict, without the use of lethal force. There are ways to subdue people without killing them. And unfortunately, what will get you a tase in Europe will get you shot and killed in America because we are much more trigger happy. So what I'm suggesting really is that we got to not just look at the types of guns. I mean, at the end of the day, the types of guns, we could have a lot of debates about it. But overall, do we need a society with more weaponry, more access to weapons for the idea that we're going to be safe? And I got to say this too quickly, because to the argument about this notion of government tyranny, the scary idea that what happens if the government falls apart or they try to come and kill you? Man, if you got your gun, you're going to be okay. I'm like, let's play this out for a second, okay? Because I hear this all the time. So let's say that the government falls apart, right? And let's just say that they decide they want to take us all, take us all. I mean, I get into these debates all the time with folks. And I say, so okay, I got my gun in the house. Now the U.S. government is coming with tanks, with the military, with soldiers to take me down, and I got my handgun in my house, and you think that's going to actually do something? That's not going to happen. Fact of the matter is, if that's really the argument, then we need to all have buku guns in our house, a plethora of weaponry. And we ought to not just stop at guns, then we ought to start talking about rocket launchers and grenades and a variety of other things that are going to protect us if our goal is the protection of ourselves against a government. Come on, guys. This is a false idea that has been used to keep guns in our culture. And we, more than any community in America, are suffering from this. 59% of the handgun murders in America are people of color, African Americans. But guess what else is scary? So we make up just over half of the number of people who are murdered every year for handguns. But 90%, I think it's actually 93%, 90% of people who are killed with handguns by suicide, self-inflicted, are European Americans, white Americans. So here's what's happening. Suicides are killing them at unbelievable numbers. Homicide is killing us at unbelievable numbers. Which is better? Neither. Let's get rid of guns.
I want to give you
I have to rebut that.
a chance to respond, and then I really want to open it up to the audience if you guys want to start thinking, if you have any questions. Go ahead, though.
I totally disagree there. And up until this point, we haven't talked much about the government itself and having to defend ourselves from the government. I think we were talking mostly about defending ourselves against citizens. But I think defending ourselves against the government is the most important reason to own guns, and I think that's why the Second Amendment was really put in place when it was. Being a black man in America, I think one of the most challenging experiences that I've ever had to experience was the look of a white police officer staring me down in my eyes, and basically with every intent to either do me harm or to take away any rights that I thought I had. In that situation, when metal to metal, I don't think that I want to rely on some written law. The only law that I would care about in that situation is human law. He could come with tanks or army trucks and bazookas or whatever. I think that looking at the amount of artillery and the amount of weapons and things that the opposition could potentially have, I think we underestimate human resolve. Ethiopia, one of the greatest countries in Africa, has never been successfully colonized. They were outmanned, they were outgunned, but a person from Robbins, Illinois, a town that's not too far from here, one of the first incorporated black towns in the United States, actually went out there, and he trained the Air Force in Ethiopia and prevented the Europeans from coming in to colonize them. No matter how much heavy artillery they had, no matter how much funding they had, they were able to stop themselves from being oppressed. The will to be free is much stronger than the will to enslave. So when someone in this country grabs their rifle and raises that flag, I get chills over my body, because I know that at any time a government can oppress its people. Laws can be inflicted that can take away our ability to do whatever we want. I'm pretty sure all of you can think of a law right now that really just ticks you off, that you had no control, or you feel like you had no control over to stop it from happening. I mean, it's sugar tax, for instance, right? I'm pretty sure a lot of us are upset about that sugar tax, and what can we do about it? There's nothing we can do about it. And just imagine the laws being stacked on you. one after another, to actually, it started off as a small sugar tax, to now they've taken away your guns. Now they're telling you how to dress. Now you can't go to certain neighborhoods at a certain time until your rights just continuously become taken away, just like they did the Jews in Nazi Germany. These things are real, and I don't believe that we're far enough into the future or far enough into history to where those types of threats have been eradicated from society.
Thank you. Does anyone have a question from the audience?
Hello, my name is Money Pleasant, and I just want to say that I disagree about the government having all the power and putting this tax and that tax, but honestly, it's not that. It's us that's the problem, because we have to elect the officials, and as long as we don't vote and certain people get in power, it wouldn't matter, because the government isn't really the issue. We have to elect them. We barely vote ourselves.
I agree fully. Thank you very much. But let me say this though, to Amani, before we get to the next question. Our voting is connected to the interpretation of this right. Our voting is connected to the amount of violence that is acceptable in our community. Our voting is connected to the economic opportunities that dissuade people from being involved in voting, or involved in violence. So the truth is, what she's saying is very important, but I do believe that they work hand in hand. If we vote and we protest and we organize and we're connected and we pay attention, then we will begin, I believe, in our communities to see less violence than we do right now.
If I may, just very quick, I think voting is a false sense of authority and a false sense of order. We can vote, and I believe we should vote. That's the first part. But what happens when we vote and somehow things doesn't go the way that we voted? Donald President Trump was really, really upset if he thought that he wasn't going to win this election. And with all the vitriol and the menacing tone in which he speaks to his supporters, could you imagine what could have happened if he lost the election, yet he came out with the rhetoric that somehow the voting was tampered with or something like that? We could have had some serious issues. So I wouldn't necessarily see voting as a measure of our authority or order in society.
Hello. You said that you strongly believe that we shouldn't have gun control laws, right? You strongly support that, right? Because you feel that we should be able to protect ourselves from any type of threat. But what about protecting ourselves from ourselves? The lack of gun control laws enables any and everybody to have guns, even the mentally disturbed. And that's one of the reasons why we have these Sandy Hook shootings, as well as all these other killings that goes on. My question to you is, do you feel comfortable with the lack of gun control? Do you feel comfortable with people with mental illness getting guns?
I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm against gun control, but I'm more so for gun rights. I think I'd be remiss to believe that overarching view of my right to carry a gun and your right to carry a gun takes away the need to look at different situations closely and come up with common sense solutions. I don't believe that you should be able to walk around with an AK-47 in a city of 2.5 million people in broad daylight. I don't agree with that whatsoever. I don't believe that people who have committed horrible acts of violence should be allowed to carry guns in certain situations. I disagree with that. So I believe that that's why we have legislators and different governing bodies locally who should be able to decide on what levels of control. But we always need that fundamental right to bear arms weighing down on those people who make those decisions in those specific areas.
The challenge with this thought and this position is, I believe, is that when you make the argument for gun rights, you're also making the argument for the proliferation of guns and those guns having the opportunity to fall into the wrong hands. When people argue that we ought to have guns in our homes to protect ourselves, do you realize that a gun is 3 times more likely to kill a person in the house than it is to kill an intruder? And so I don't know that we can have both. I try to be pretty bipartisan on a lot of issues, but on this one it's very difficult because the ultimate end result of protecting gun rights means that we also protect people's rights to get guns who we don't think ought to have them. Please pay attention. The Republicans in Congress just supported the use of guns and more access to guns for those who are mentally ill. You have to know this. This is a news story that just came out about a month or so ago. I did a video commentary on it, but to suggest that we can have rights but keep them out of all the bad people's hands, what happens when the good people become bad people? And when we have easy access, some of us who are okay today don't really need guns in our hands at certain points. You understand what I'm saying?
Go ahead.
Although the technology is different now than what the forefathers penned for the Second Amendment, the results are still the same. A gun is loaded, it is fired, somebody dies, correct? Although, do you believe that the forefathers were ignorant of that fact? And with that being said, in the writing of the Second Amendment, it also gives way for us to believe that the Second Amendment was put in place for our protection for both enemies, foreign and domestic. What are you guys' view and comments on that?
I'll start. The first thing about the Second Amendment being in place for enemies, foreign and domestic, I cannot, not think about the fact that I'm a black man in America who has dealt with, extreme levels of physical threats from racism. I mean, we have to, put that out there. And that's a domestic threat, not only from other citizens, but from the government itself. So to disarm me would be a threat to my existence. When I think about Black Wall Street in 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma, we actually saw that played out. We saw a young black man being taken for extrajudicial murder, basically, and then taken outside to be hung. Black men from the community, business owners, wealthy men, leaders of that community grabbed their guns, and they went to defend that young black man. And other people in the community grabbed their guns, and they decided that they were going to continue in that extrajudicial killing. And they had a fight. They wore it out. Unfortunately, those black men came up on the short end of that battle. Just in case you don't know, that community was bombed from the sky with airplanes. It was the first time that any community in the world was bombed from the sky with airplanes. And this wasn't just citizens doing this. This was an act of government. This was an act of state-sponsored terrorism. And there's lots of evidence of that. So in that case, to tell me that I don't need a gun, I had a gun and I still couldn't properly defend myself in that situation.
Professor Darden, I would say in response, my quick response to that is that he's correct about Black Wall Street. Very much understand and agree with that. I just don't think, even as a person of color, to suggest that we take up arms against the government, how do you think that's going to end in America?
Respectfully, there's a lot of points that I do agree with you, but there are a few that I may disagree, and there's a lot that I agree with you on your end. For me, being in the military, personally, being trained on how to use a M16 and a few other bits of armament, but nonetheless, I think it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it, kind of like insurance. One thing that you did speak of in Japan, and I've been out there a couple of years back, and yes, they do have tight constrictions on guns. They feel as though you don't need it at all, as well as knives too. They only could be like a certain extent. But one thing that's missing up out of that statement is the fact that they have what's called police booths, like every other block. And I'm pretty sure if they get pulled over for a ticket, they wouldn't look at them the same way that, I would be viewed, from a police officer that may be Caucasian, for that matter, and I'm out in the Gold Coast, So another thing that I did notice that, as far as you guys touched on, and I kind of agree on both ends, is actually narrative. If you have somebody that's Caucasian living out in rural Illinois and they out hunting, it's a different narrative than it would be if it's one of you gentlemen that has a weapon. When I'm leaving out of town, I got to go defend my country, whether I'm getting deployed or it's just a few weeks out or whatever the case may be. I have a wife and 2 girls. I feel a lot better when I'm leaving my wife with something to arm myself in case something happens in my absence. And even sometimes when I'm there, I feel a lot better. Another thing you did stipulate was training. That's very important, because even with myself maybe arming my wife, I do teach her how to hold a weapon and how to, how it works and how to clean it and how important it is, the difference between certain guns with revolvers not jamming, however, with ones with clips, they do jam. So, those are important aspects of it.
Thank you.
I want to add something. Antoine is in my class. He just returned from Texas. He served our country with the Texan flood. So let's give him a round of applause.
What would you guys think if the Constitution was revised or updated? Should it be revised and updated or changed at any point, since we're in a new society of life?
I'll start with that one. I don't think it needs to be updated or revised on this issue. I think it needs to be interpreted correctly. I think people need to read the Constitution. If you read the Constitution, and I do this in my class with my students, we're doing this in about 2 weeks, we're going to go through and look at the other part of the Second Amendment conversation, which is Article 1, Section 8, in which they lay out what a militia is supposed to do. And if you read that section 4 or 5 lines, it shows that the militia clearly is under the authority of the state government, who's clearly under the authority of the federal government. And yes, you would have arms in your home, but you would be called at times of crisis to suppress insurrections, repel invasions, and to protect your society. I would suggest that the National Guard serves that very function today, and because of that, the Second Amendment, the way that we interpret it, I think is false, it's erroneous, and we need to go back and look at it. The Supreme Court, in the 2 cases I just mentioned, 5-4, that's how close they were. 5 people said the Second Amendment gives people an individual right. 4 people said exactly what I'm saying. And unfortunately, they were outvoted, and so now we have no handgun ban in Chicago, easier access to guns in Chicago. How's that working for us?
If I may, when it comes to the wording of the Second Amendment and the Section 1, or is it Section 1, Article 1, Section 8, I think that's very, very important. That wording, is it on here? Well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. Leading into that sentence, I don't know what an English instructor characterized that as a properly well syntaxed sentence, but it gives a reasoning behind why someone needs to bear arms. And then it just says flat out that the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. Is it that it shall not be infringed because of a well-regulated militia? Or was that just a strong reason to why it shall not be infringed? The bottom line, though, is at the end of that sentence clearly states that the right for the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. And then when you look up the further clarification, as you stated, Professor Williams, it establishes what a well-regulated militia is, and that militia is controlled by the state. But you still have the right of the people to bear arms, to even be able to join that militia. Because even when you think of an idea of a militia, and the gentleman that was military may have some input on this, a militia isn't people that are trained and battle tested and ready for war. A militia is a group of people who may always be thinking of the threat of war, so they're always ready. And to be ready, citizens must have guns. If our citizens don't have guns, where would our militia possibly come from?
Thank you for your question.
Good afternoon.
Good
Professor
afternoon, sir.
Williams, how you doing today?
Good, sir. Good, sir.
I have a question and a comment. First question. Do you think there's any connection between Chicago itself being a sanctuary city and, with that said, being a sanctuary city connecting with the gun violence that's been happening recently in Chicago? And number two is more or less a statement. When we talk about electing the president of the United States, I know there's a lot of conversation between, who makes the decision of the president getting in office. Is it the Electoral College or is it the popular vote? And I think more, I would say, conversation needs to be had in terms of who really makes the decision of the president getting in office, especially then with this last election. Granted, it might have been more numbers in terms of the popular vote, but at the end of the day, it was the Electoral College that actually got the president in office.
The sanctuary city question, there is a horribly unfortunate conversation and narrative that is coming out of the White House that many of our crime and violence problems in America are the result of illegal immigrants. And I refuse to validate that idea. Of course, you are going to have a certain percentage of the population who is here illegally that are going to be engaged in crimes. But the correlation between the idea of a sanctuary city and high rates of crime cannot really be made. I reject it. I will not blame another marginalized group for our crime and violence issues. We have to take care of our own issues, and believe you me, there are many more Americans killing each other than there are people who are coming from other places coming to this country killing us.
I have to follow up on that one. I think it's been estimated that we have 20 million undocumented immigrants from Mexico alone in our country. And I think that's a high number. I think more reasonable people put it at about 11 million. But can you imagine what 11 million looks like? 20 million? We're talking about 20 million people illegally in the country. So to compare that in Chicago to being a sanctuary city and understanding how many people could possibly be undocumented living in the city of Chicago, and how that could relate to criminality in the city of Chicago, I think that's huge. Because what does it take to get 20 million people illegally into a country? I'm pretty sure there's pipelines. So actually, I am sure that there are pipelines of all type of criminal activity coming straight along with those people. We're talking identity theft, we're talking drugs, we're talking guns, we're talking a lot of different things. So the sanctuary city thing, I think, is bad for law and order. Comparing that to the gun issue, I think that is a number one problem that we're having with illegal guns that are not supposed to be here, and guns that are seeping into the streets of the city of Chicago.
Just to clarify, you're saying illegal guns coming from illegal immigrants?
Illegal guns coming from that, I want to say, that trade in bringing people into the country illegally. That's like a pipeline, a Silk Road, if I may, and that is contributing to the amount of guns in the city of Chicago. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
Go ahead.
With so many guns out in the world today in our own country, the statement that I fear for my life is often heard, whether it's a citizen or officer or anyone who could be opposed by a gun. If we eliminated all lethal ways of solving our problems and subduing different groups or protecting ourselves via other means, if it's possible to have non-lethal things that can stop people from doing harm, why is it so important to have things that can kill people, that causes people to fear for their life, that causes them to take lives?
I don't know. I agree with you. So he can answer that question. I don't know why we have to have so many lethal weapons. and we cannot utilize non-lethal weapons to subdue people and to enforce law and order?
I believe culture and the idea of virtue is very, very important, right? When you teach people how to get along with each other, and we make that a part of our culture, I think we help to eliminate certain things like that more than trying to legislate it away. I think the idea of legislating violent tools to do harm is a liberal ideal that I think cannot really be played out. For instance, we got different countries, right? We got different countries who are basically belligerent towards each other. The fact that we are a different country, in my mind, means that there's a diplomatic understanding that we could possibly go to war with each other. So that would be the first step to even begin to think about legislating away something like a gun in society. We have to become one society, right? And then when we become one society and we demilitarize ourselves in this ideal of harmony, what about the threat from outside this planet? Now that's a totally different conversation on whether we believe in aliens or not, but those are the types of things that we have to worry about.
Professor Williams and the visiting professor, I heard y'all emphasizing a lot on the militia and having a real regulated, militia but governed by the state and all this, but isn't the police departments like birthed from the militia, like they rose up from the militia, and you still got police departments that's regulated by the state, that's trained, that's still killing and doing murders every single day and getting acquitted of it. So I don't believe that stricter gun laws be the answer to resolving a lot of violence in the city. You could set a gun on the table and it won't kill nobody. It'll sit there and just rust up. Not until someone pick the gun up and use it to shoot somebody does it commit a murder. And with that being said, I think it's an emotional mismanagement that we're dealing with when it comes to the people. And it's more of a, like you said, economic and social issue than it is stricter gun laws. The gun laws themselves, when you got other entities that's involving in bringing a lot of these weapons into these communities, and then putting stricter gun laws on if they're getting caught with them in their hand it's a whole setup in itself. And I just believe like it needs more help dealing with the psychological side of people than it is just dealing with laws and trying to put people in a cage for longer bits of time and have them doing free labor down there, But
Good point, sir.
Thank you.
Visiting Professor,
No, go ahead.
I have a comment and a question. Do you realize that the ideology of every man for themselves, putting a gun in everybody's hand, could eventually wipe us out? 2, do you believe in big government?
No, I don't believe in big government. That's a long conversation, though, and I love to follow up with you after. But the idea of putting a gun in everyone's hands wipe us out, I don't think so. Like I said, it all goes back to culture. I believe someone said an emotional breakdown or something like that. Those comments that was just mentioned. I can reach over and potentially, and I hate to say it, kill one of the people next to me right now. There's nothing they could do. I mean, there's police officers.
But you wouldn't,
on
would
campus.
you?
No, I wouldn't. Of course not.
Just making sure.
But there's police officers on campus. I believe there's one right outside this door. I believe that he is even armed, but he couldn't stop someone from doing something like that in the room, right? So, when we get into that type of thinking, I think that we take an ideal and we take a hypothetical so far that we kind of overlook the relation that we have to each other as a species.
And I would just say, for me, in closing on this, that I agree, the gun, whoever the gentleman was that said that, the gun cannot get up and shoot someone, but easy access to guns with people, around people with mental illness and stress and economic inequality, it just makes for a very bad situation.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. If you want to stick around, I know that these two gentlemen, thank you both for being here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
And thank you all for being here.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Have a great day. Thank you all.